On a bitter November evening in a crowded community center, a homeless 12-year-old boy named Thomas shouted 3 words that would change 2 lives forever. "Don't eat that!" he cried, lunging toward a stranger about to taste the charity dinner's casserole. The man froze, his fork suspended in midair, confusion flickering across his weathered face. Thomas didn't know that the ordinary-looking stranger in threadbare clothes was Richard Harrington, a millionaire who had lost everything that mattered 5 years ago when his 8-year-old son died from food poisoning. He didn't know that Richard now spent his fortune anonymously fighting the very tragedy that had destroyed his family. And Richard had no idea that the terrified homeless boy standing before him had tried desperately and futilely to save his son that horrible night so long ago. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just 1 click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The wind cut through the streets like a blade, carrying the promise of winter's first snow. Richard Harrington pulled his worn coat tighter around his shoulders, the fabric rough against his skin, so different from the cashmere and silk that hung in his closet 30 miles away in his empty mansion. He walked with his head down, his 52-year-old frame stooped as if carrying an invisible weight, passing beneath the flickering streetlights of the city's forgotten neighborhood. No one who passed him on the cracked sidewalk would have recognized the face that graced the business sections of newspapers, the man whose signature appeared on charitable foundation documents worth millions. That was precisely how Richard wanted it. Every month for the past 3 years, he had made this pilgrimage, shedding his wealth like a snake sheds its skin, dressing in clothes purchased from thrift stores, becoming invisible. He came to these charity dinners not to observe from a distance, not to write checks and feel virtuous, but to sit among the broken and forgotten, to search for something his money could never buy. Authenticity, connection. Perhaps, though he would never admit it aloud, absolution. The community center appeared ahead, a squat brick building with bars on the windows and hope in its heart. Warm light spilled from the doorway, and with it came the smell of cooking food, the sound of voices, the promise of human warmth against the November cold. Richard paused at the threshold, steadying himself as he always did, pushing down the memories that threatened to rise. Inside, volunteers in mismatched aprons moved between folding tables covered in plastic cloths. They ladled soup into styrofoam bowls, arranged donated bread on plates, smiled with tired eyes at the line of people waiting to be fed. These volunteers knew nothing of quarterly reports or board meetings. They knew only the simple mathematics of compassion, of feeding the hungry 1 meal at a time. Richard joined the line, anonymous among the anonymous. Just another man seeking warmth on a bitter night. At the far corner of the community center, near the door where cold air seeped through the gaps, stood a boy who seemed to be made of shadows and silence. Thomas was 12 years old, though the streets had aged him in ways that numbers could not measure. His coat, 3 sizes too large, hung from his thin shoulders like a shroud, its hem frayed and stained with the evidence of countless nights spent in doorways and under bridges. The sleeves were rolled up multiple times, revealing wrists so thin they seemed barely capable of supporting his careful, watchful hands. His dark hair fell across his forehead in unwashed tangles, but his face, though smudged with dirt, held a strange dignity. A quiet intelligence in eyes that had seen too much too soon. Those eyes, brown and bottomless, moved constantly across the room, cataloging everything, missing nothing. He watched the volunteers serve the food with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. He noted which dishes came from which containers, observed how the casserole had been sitting out longer than the soup, noticed the slight discoloration at the edges of the meat. Thomas had learned that survival depended on observation, that the difference between sickness and health, between life and death, often came down to details others overlooked. He lingered at the threshold between the warmth inside and the cold outside, neither fully entering nor leaving, a ghost haunting the margins of human kindness. He was hungry. God! He was always hungry. A gnawing emptiness that had become as familiar as breathing. But hunger had taught him caution, had made him careful in ways that well-fed children never needed to be. Other people approached the tables with eager hands and grateful faces. Thomas waited, watched, assessed. There was a protocol to survival that the fortunate never had to learn. An instinct born from nights when a wrong choice meant pain. His mother had taught him to say please and thank you, to respect his elders, to stand tall even when the world tried to make him small. She had been gone for 2 years now, but her lessons remained, carved into his bones like commandments. Richard had taken his seat at one of the long tables, accepting his plate with a quiet thank you that the volunteer barely heard over the din of conversation. The casserole steamed before him, chunks of meat swimming in gravy, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel grateful for this simple thing, this basic human need being met. He lifted his fork, the metal cool in his hand, and brought it toward the food. The room continued its symphony of scraping chairs and murmured conversations, of spoons against bowls and the shuffle of feet. No one noticed the boy in the oversized coat suddenly go rigid near the door. No one saw Thomas's eyes widen with recognition, with horror, as he identified something wrong in the way the meat glistened, in the faint smell that others had dismissed. For 3 eternal seconds, Thomas stood paralyzed by his old enemy, the fear of being seen, of being heard, of being dismissed as just another homeless child causing trouble. But then he saw the fork moving toward the man's mouth, and something deeper than fear took over. Something his mother had planted in him, a seed that poverty and loss could not kill, the instinct to protect, even at the cost of his own invisibility. "Don't eat that!" The words exploded from Thomas's throat, raw and desperate, cutting through the noise like a siren. He was running forward before he knew his feet were moving, his too large coat flapping behind him like broken wings. "Don't eat that! Please, don't eat it!" The room froze. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the source of the commotion. Richard's fork stopped inches from his lips, his body responding to the genuine terror in the boy's voice before his mind could process what was happening. Thomas skidded to a stop beside Richard's table, his thin chest heaving, his finger pointing with trembling certainty at the casserole. He gasped, his voice breaking with urgency and fear. "Something's wrong with the meat. Look at it. Really look at it. The color's wrong. The smell. Please, you can't eat it." A volunteer rushed forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Young man, you need to leave right now. We will not tolerate this kind of disruption." She reached for Thomas's arm, but he pulled back, his eyes never leaving the plate. Around the room, murmurs spread like wildfire through dry grass. An elderly man shook his head in disgust. A woman clutched her purse tighter, as if the homeless boy might snatch it. "Always causing problems," someone muttered from across the room. "Ungrateful," another voice added, sharp with judgment. "We're trying to help people, and this is what we get." Thomas's face burned with shame, but he stood his ground, his thin body trembling not with fear now, but with desperate conviction. He had been dismissed before, thrown out of places, told to move along, treated as invisible or worse, as a problem to be solved. He knew how this would end, but he could not, would not, let this man eat food that might kill him. Richard held up his hand, a gesture so quietly authoritative that the volunteer stopped mid-reach. "Wait," he said, his voice calm but firm. He looked at Thomas, really looked at him, and saw past the dirty coat and tangled hair to the intelligence burning in those haunted eyes. Something in the boy's terror felt familiar, felt true. "Explain it to me, son. What do you see?" Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. Words felt impossible, too big and clumsy for his mouth, but he forced them out. "The meat, sir. The edges. They're gray, not brown like cooked meat should be. And underneath, where it touches the gravy, it's greenish. That's bacterial growth. And the smell, if you get close, it's sweet but wrong, like when food sits too long in heat." His voice gained strength as he spoke, the words he had memorized from library books tumbling out. "The texture, too? See how it's breaking apart too easily? That's protein degradation. Something happened to the storage. The refrigeration, maybe. This has been warm too long." The community center director, a heavy-set woman named Margaret who had been serving the homeless for 20 years, approached the table with visible reluctance. She had prepared this food herself that morning, had followed every protocol she knew. The implication that something was wrong felt like an accusation against her competence, her care, but Richard's steady gaze and the boy's unwavering certainty made her bend down to examine the casserole more closely. She leaned in, her nose hovering above the dish, and her expression changed. The defensive set of her jaw softened into confusion, then concern, then horror. "Oh God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. She straightened abruptly, her face pale. "Nobody eat the casserole. Nobody touch it." Her voice rose to a shout. "Put down your forks. Anyone who has the casserole, do not eat another bite." Panic rippled through the room. People who had already eaten looked at their empty plates with sudden terror. Margaret was already moving toward the kitchen, her comfortable shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. Richard stood and followed, Thomas at his heels like a shadow. In the kitchen, Margaret flung open the walk-in refrigerator and let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a curse. The unit was running now, humming its normal mechanical song. But a digital thermometer mounted inside told a damning story. The temperature read 42 degrees now, but the recorded high from overnight blinked in angry red numbers. 68 degrees. For at least 6 hours, according to the log, the unit had failed completely, turning the refrigerator into an incubator for every dangerous bacteria that called raw meat home. Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, all given the perfect conditions to multiply into potentially lethal colonies. Margaret sank against the door frame, her face in her hands. The maintenance company said they fixed it last week. I checked it this morning and it felt cold. I thought everything was fine. I served it to 30 people. 30 people. Her voice broke. Richard turned from the kitchen, his mind reeling with what could have happened, with what Thomas had prevented. He needed to thank the boy, to understand how a homeless child possessed knowledge that had just saved lives. But when he returned to the main room, Thomas was gone. The space where he had stood was empty, just disturbed air and the fading echo of his desperate warning. Richard rushed to the door and threw it open, the November wind slapping his face with icy hands. The street stretched dark and empty in both directions, the pools of streetlight revealing nothing but scattered trash and the endless urban decay. The boy had vanished like smoke, dissolved back into whatever shadows had birthed him. Something twisted in Richard's chest, an ache he recognized too well, the feeling of losing something precious before you even knew you held it. He stood on the steps, searching the darkness, knowing it was futile but unable to stop himself. Those eyes, he could not shake the image of those eyes, so old in such a young face, burning with knowledge and fear and a desperate need to save a stranger. What kind of child carried that burden? What kind of life created such vigilance? Richard went back inside where Margaret was making frantic phone calls to everyone who had taken food home, warning them, apologizing through tears. He approached her gently when she hung up. "The boy who warned us. Thomas, do you know him?" Margaret wiped her eyes and shook her head. "He comes sometimes. Not often, maybe once a month, always hanging back, never taking much. I don't even know his last name. He never signs the register." She gestured to the clipboard where visitors were supposed to log their names, a formality most ignored. "He's homeless?" Richard pressed, though he already knew the answer. "I think so. Some of the regulars have mentioned seeing him sleeping in the park under the bridge on 7th Street. But he's like a ghost, here one moment, gone the next." Richard returned to the community center the next morning in a different costume, wearing the armor of his real identity. The tailored suit, the polished shoes, the bearing of a man accustomed to boardrooms and deference. Margaret barely recognized him until he introduced himself. And then her eyes went wide with the shock of understanding. "Richard Harrington. The Richard Harrington." She stammered apologies for not recognizing him, but he waved them away with an impatient hand. "I need to find the boy," he said. "Thomas. I need to find him." Over coffee in her cramped office, Richard told her what he had never told strangers, the story he usually kept locked behind walls of money and silence. 5 years ago, his son Daniel had turned 8 years old. They had celebrated at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the wealthy went to be seen. Daniel had ordered the chicken, his favorite. Within hours, he was vomiting, feverish, convulsing. By the time they reached the hospital, the bacteria had spread through his small body like wildfire through paper. E. coli, the doctors said. Improperly handled poultry. A kitchen refrigerator that had malfunctioned and been ignored. Daniel died 3 days later, his little hand going cold in Richard's grip. The restaurant paid settlements, admitted no wrongdoing, and closed quietly 6 months later. Richard's marriage, already strained by the demands of wealth and business, shattered under the weight of shared grief. His wife left, unable to look at him without seeing their dead son's eyes. Richard threw himself into his work, made more millions, felt nothing. Then one day, he established a foundation dedicated to food safety, pouring money into inspections, education, policy reform, all of it anonymous because his name felt like a curse. He began attending charity dinners incognito, searching for something he could not name. Until last night, when a homeless boy had done what no adult had done for his Daniel. Seen the danger, spoken up, saved a life. For 7 days, Richard walked the streets that most men of his station never saw. He visited parks where the homeless gathered under graffitied bridges, their belongings stuffed into shopping carts and garbage bags. He searched shelters where hollow-eyed men and women queued for cots, where the smell of unwashed bodies and institutional soap created a perfume of desperation. He checked behind restaurants where dumpsters offered both treasure and shame to those hungry enough to look. His driver, James, a man who had worked for Richard for 15 years, watched his employer's transformation with barely concealed alarm. "Sir, perhaps you should let the foundation's staff handle this," he suggested carefully as Richard climbed back into the town car after another fruitless afternoon. "We have people trained for outreach work." But Richard only shook his head, his jaw set with the same determination that had built his empire. His assistant, Caroline, was more direct. She cornered him in his office, her arms crossed, her concern overriding professional boundaries. "You're not sleeping. You're barely eating. This isn't healthy, Richard. Why are you doing this?" "Because a boy with nothing had tried to save everything," Richard wanted to say. "Because 5 years ago, no one saved Daniel. Because kindness in the face of suffering was rarer than diamonds and infinitely more precious." But he said none of this aloud. Each night, Richard returned to his mansion that felt more like a mausoleum, its 20 rooms echoing with absence. He lay in his king-sized bed and saw Thomas's face, those haunted eyes, that desperate courage. Where did a child sleep when he had no home? How cold was he tonight? Was he hungry? Sick? Afraid? The streets had shown Richard a world his wealth had carefully concealed. He saw children Thomas's age begging at intersections, their signs written in crayon. He saw women with babies sleeping on steam grates. He saw the invisible army of the forgotten. And he understood with crushing clarity how easy it was for society to look away, to step over, to pretend not to see. On the 8th day, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruise and ash, Richard saw him. The grocery store on Maple Street was closing, its fluorescent lights dimming one by one, when movement in the alley caught his eye. A small figure crouched beside the dumpster where the store discarded produce, too wilted to sell but not yet completely rotten. Thomas, he was sorting through a cardboard box of tired vegetables with careful, practiced hands, setting aside the ones too far gone, keeping those that might still offer nutrition without illness. His fingers, red from cold, moved with the precision of a surgeon, checking for mold, for soft spots, for the telltale signs of decay. Richard approached slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal, understanding that sudden movements meant flight. "Thomas," he said softly. And the boy's head snapped up, his body already tensing to run. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by confusion, then fear. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Richard continued, keeping his distance, his hands visible and open. "I've been looking for you. To thank you. What you did at the community center, you saved lives. You saved my life." Thomas remained poised for escape, his thin frame coiled like a spring. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rough. Don't need thanks. Richard gestured toward the grocery store behind them, its doors now locked. Please, let me buy you dinner, a real meal. You're hungry, and I'm grateful. And sometimes it's okay to accept kindness. The war played out across Thomas's face, pride battling with the gnawing emptiness in his belly. Hunger won. They sat on a bench in the small park across the street, sandwiches from the deli next door warm in their hands. Turkey and Swiss for Thomas. Roast beef for Richard, though neither man was really tasting food. Thomas ate slowly, carefully, as if rationing each bite against future famine. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the city filling the spaces between them. Cars passed. A siren wailed in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked at shadows. Richard waited, understanding instinctively that patience was required here, that trust could not be rushed or bought. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice so quiet Richard had to lean closer to hear. My mom died 2 years ago. Cancer. We didn't have insurance, didn't have money for the treatments that might have saved her. She worked 3 jobs, and it still wasn't enough. He took another bite of sandwich, chewing slowly. I don't know who my father is. She never talked about him. I think maybe he didn't want us. The words were delivered without self-pity, just facts recited like weather reports. Richard's heart constricted. What happened after she passed? Thomas shrugged, a gesture too old for his young shoulders. Social services wanted to put me in the system. Foster care. I ran. I just couldn't let them take me to some stranger's house and pretend to be part of a family that wasn't mine. My mom's memory, it's all I have left. Our apartment, her things. Even though they're gone now, I remember where we lived. I go back sometimes. Sit on the steps. If I let them put me somewhere else, it would be like erasing her. Richard nodded, understanding this logic that was both heartbreaking and beautiful in its loyalty. And the food safety knowledge? How does a 12-year-old boy know about bacterial growth and temperature protocols? For the first time, something like pride flickered across Thomas's face. The library on 4th Street. It's warm there, and they don't kick me out if I'm quiet. I started reading books about food, about cooking, about safety. It started because of Mom. She got sick from bad food a few weeks before the cancer diagnosis. Street vendor chicken that had been sitting in the sun too long. I couldn't help her then, couldn't save her, but I thought maybe I could learn enough to save someone else. Thomas's eyes grew distant, looking past Richard to some memory only he could see. Every morning, when the library opens at 9, I'm there. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, she pretends not to notice that I wash up in the bathroom, that sometimes I sleep in the reading alcove if security doesn't find me. She just points me toward the new books that came in, asks if I need help finding anything. He finished his sandwich and carefully folded the wrapper, tucking it into his pocket to throw away later. I've read everything they have on food science. The chemistry of cooking, the biology of bacteria, FDA guidelines, restaurant safety protocols. I memorized temperature danger zones, learned which foods are highest risk, studied the symptoms of different types of food poisoning. I know that salmonella takes 6 to 72 hours to show symptoms, that botulism affects your nervous system, that listeria is especially dangerous for pregnant women. The words poured out of him now, a dam breaking. Before Mom got sick from that food, I never thought about it. You eat, you get full, that's all. But watching her in pain, seeing her body reject everything she tried to eat afterward, and then the cancer coming so soon after, like her immune system was already weakened and couldn't fight anymore. His voice cracked. The doctors said the food poisoning and cancer weren't related. But I wonder sometimes. I wonder if I had stopped her from eating that chicken. If I had known then what I know now, would she still be alive? Richard felt tears pressing behind his eyes. You were 10 years old. You couldn't have known. Thomas looked at him then, those ancient eyes in that young face. But I can know now. I can't save her, but I can learn everything, watch everything, and maybe save someone else's mother, someone else's child. That's why I go to the charity dinners sometimes, why I watch the food trucks in restaurants. I see things others miss because I'm invisible, because I'm just a homeless kid nobody looks at twice. Richard studied the boy beside him. This child who spoke with the vocabulary of a health inspector, who understood protocols that most restaurant owners ignored. There was something more here, something beyond library books and observation. The specificity of his knowledge suggested experience, not just academic understanding. Thomas, Richard said carefully, you know things that go beyond reading. The way you identified the problem at the community center, you didn't just see discoloration. You understood the progression, the timeline, the specific type of failure. That's not just book learning. Thomas's fingers twisted together, a tell that Richard recognized as nervousness. The boy was deciding something, weighing whether to trust this stranger who bought him sandwiches and asked questions. I watch restaurants, Thomas finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, through the windows at night, after the dinner rush starts. Most places have windows into the kitchen or dining rooms lit up bright. I stand outside where it's dark, and I watch cooking shows that I can't afford on televisions I don't own. I see the chefs work, see the tickets come in, see how they handle the food. He glanced at Richard, gauging his reaction. Some places, they're so careful. Everything timed, everything clean, temperatures checked constantly. But others, you can see them cutting corners, leaving food out too long, using the same cutting boards for raw meat and vegetables, servers carrying plates they've touched with bare hands after handling money. I memorize it all, the good practices and the bad ones. Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. How long have you been doing this? Thomas shrugged. Since Mom died. Maybe before, but more seriously after. There's this Italian place on 7th, they're perfect. The chef, he's like a scientist. And then there's the burger joint on Commonwealth. They're going to make someone sick eventually. I tried to tell the manager once. He threatened to call the cops on me. There was one place, though, Thomas continued, his voice taking on a darker tone. About 5 years ago, before I really understood what I was seeing. An expensive restaurant downtown, glass walls, fancy tablecloths, the kind of place where people celebrate important things. Richard's blood turned to ice in his veins. His hands gripped the edge of the bench, knuckles white. It was called something French. Something. They had these big windows, and I could see right into the kitchen from the alley where I used to sleep with Mom. She was still alive then, still working, and I'd wait for her shift to end. Thomas's eyes grew haunted, staring into the past. The kitchen was wrong. I didn't have the words for it then. Didn't understand all the science, but I could see things. The refrigerator door kept popping open, like the seal was broken. The chef kept pushing it closed, but it would swing back. And they kept pulling meat out of it, using it anyway. I watched them for weeks. I tried to tell people going in. I stood by the door and said the food wasn't safe, that something was wrong with the cold storage. His voice grew smaller. Security threw me out, called me a little beggar trying to ruin their business. One of the waiters dumped water on me to make me leave. But I kept trying because I knew something bad was going to happen. And then one night, there was this family. A mother and father and a little boy with blonde hair. He was wearing a birthday crown, one of those paper ones. He was so excited, bouncing in his chair, and they brought him this chicken dish. Richard could not breathe, could not move, could not do anything but listen as Thomas described the worst night of his life from the other side of the glass. I tried to get inside again. I was screaming that the food was bad, that the refrigerator was broken. The security guard grabbed me, held me outside. Thomas's words came faster now, tumbling over each other as if a dam had broken inside him, releasing a flood of memory he had carried alone for far too long. The little boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. He had this smile, this pure joy on his face. His parents were taking pictures, and he was laughing. And the servers brought out this big plate with a candle on it. Everyone in the restaurant was singing. Richard's vision blurred. His chest felt crushed, unable to draw breath. Daniel. He was talking about Daniel. I was beating on the glass, shouting, but the music and singing drowned me out. The security guard was dragging me away, but I fought him. I bit his hand and ran back. I could see through the window as the boy took his first bite. His father was smiling. His mother was wiping frosting from his nose. Everything looked so perfect, so happy. Thomas's voice broke, tears streaming down his dirty face. And then I watched it all fall apart. It took maybe an hour. The boy got sick right there at the table. He was vomiting, crying, and his parents were panicking. People were running around. Someone called an ambulance. I saw them carry him out on a stretcher, this little boy who had been so happy, and his mother was screaming, and his father's face was just blank, like someone had erased him from the inside. The boy turned to Richard, his eyes drowning in guilt and grief. I watched the ambulances come back 3 times that night. Other people got sick too. The restaurant closed eventually, but that boy, the birthday boy, he was the worst. I went to the hospital the next day, asked about him at the desk. They wouldn't tell me anything, but I heard nurses talking. He died. That little boy died, and I couldn't save him. I was only 7. Thomas whispered, his small frame shaking with sobs he had held back for 5 years. I was just a little kid myself, living on the streets with my mom, and I tried so hard to make them listen. But who listens to a homeless child? Who believes a dirty boy in torn clothes when he says something is wrong with their expensive restaurant? He wiped his nose with his sleeve, the gesture heartbreakingly childlike. The security guard. He grabbed me by my coat and threw me into the alley. I scraped my hands on the pavement. He told me if I came back, he'd call the police and have me taken away from my mother. But I crawled back anyway. I pressed my face against that window, and I watched the nightmare happen. I saw that little boy's smile turn to confusion, then pain, then terror. I saw his father trying to comfort him while his mother screamed for help. I saw the other diners backing away, scared of whatever was happening. I saw the manager running around, phone pressed to his ear. I saw the flashing lights of the ambulance painting everything red and blue. His voice rose with the remembered panic. I followed the ambulance to the hospital. I ran through the streets crying, my lungs burning, trying to keep the lights in sight. When I got there, I tried to tell the doctors, tried to explain about the refrigerator, about the broken seal, about the meat sitting too warm for too long. But no one would listen to a street kid. Security removed me from the emergency room. I spent that whole night sitting on the curb outside the hospital, praying to a God I wasn't sure existed that the boy would be okay. Thomas looked down at his hands, as if he could still see the blood from his scraped palms. 3 days later, I snuck back to the hospital and heard the nurses talking. The boy had died. Daniel, they said his name was, 8 years old. Dead because of bad chicken, because of a broken refrigerator, because no one would listen to a homeless child who saw the truth. The sound that came from Richard's throat was not quite human. It was the cry of a wounded animal, of a father who had lost everything, of a man who had just discovered that salvation had been standing outside his door all along, screaming to be heard. He doubled over on the bench, his hands covering his face, his entire body racked with sobs that had been building for 5 years. Daniel, he choked out. His name was Daniel. He was my son. Thomas went completely still, his tear-streaked face frozen in dawning horror. Your son, he repeated, the words barely a whisper. That was your son. Richard looked up, his face ravaged with grief, and nodded. He was my only child, 8 years old. His birthday. He wanted to go to that restaurant because they had candles in the desserts, and he loved making wishes. We took him there. We fed him poison, and 3 days later, I held his hand while he died, while his organs failed, while he begged me to make it stop hurting. He reached out with shaking hands and gripped Thomas's thin shoulders. You tried to save him. You were 7 years old, a child yourself, homeless and helpless, and you tried to save my son. While grown men and women ignored you, dismissed you, threw you away, you fought to warn us. You saw what no one else saw. You knew what no one else knew, and we We couldn't hear you through our privilege and our assumption that a place so expensive must be safe." Thomas was sobbing now, great heaving gasps that shook his entire frame. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I tried. I swear I tried." I screamed until my voice gave out. I pounded on that glass until my hands bled. But I was just a street kid, and nobody listens to street kids. I've carried him with me every day, every single day for 5 years. His face, his smile, the way it all went wrong. Richard pulled Thomas into an embrace, this broken man and this broken boy, two souls who had orbited the same tragedy from different sides of grief. They held each other on that bench as night fell completely around them, as the streetlights flickered to life, as the world continued its indifferent rotation. When the tears finally subsided into shuddering breaths, Richard pulled back and looked into Thomas's eyes. "Let me help you. Please, let me give you a home, food, school, everything you need. You saved lives at that community center. You tried to save Daniel. Let me honor that. Let me take care of you." But Thomas was already shaking his head, that old pride rising up despite everything. "I don't need charity. I don't need someone to rescue me like I'm broken. I've survived this long on my own. My mom taught me to stand on my own feet, to never beg, to keep my dignity even when the world tries to strip it away." Richard understood then. This was not a child who needed saving. This was a warrior who needed a war worth fighting. "Not charity," Richard said carefully, his mind working. "Partnership. Thomas, I run a foundation dedicated to food safety. We fund inspections, education programs, policy reform. We try to prevent what happened to Daniel from happening to anyone else. But we're missing something. We're missing the perspective of someone who sees what others don't. Someone who understands food safety not from textbooks and regulations, but from survival. Someone who watches from the outside and sees the truth." He leaned forward, his voice urgent with conviction. "Work with me. Help me make the foundation better. You know things my inspectors don't know. You see things my staff misses. Together, we could save lives. Real lives. Children like Daniel. Mothers like yours. That's not charity, Thomas. That's giving your knowledge purpose. That's turning your pain into protection for others." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his young mind weighing possibilities against pride, hope against the fear of disappointment. Finally, he nodded. Just once. A small gesture that changed everything. A trial period. 3 months. If it doesn't work, if I don't fit, I walk away. No questions, no guilt. Richard agreed immediately, understanding that control was something Thomas needed, perhaps the only thing he truly owned. Within a week, Richard had arranged an apartment, modest but clean, in a building where Thomas could come and go freely. Not Richard's mansion, not some supervised facility, but a space that was his own. There was food in the refrigerator, properly stored and organized the way Thomas insisted. There were books on the shelves, including every food safety manual Richard could find. There was a door that locked from the inside, giving Thomas the security he had lacked for 2 years. School came next, a private academy where Richard explained the situation to a compassionate principal. Thomas would attend classes, catch up on the education he had missed while surviving on the streets. The teachers were told only that he was a bright child who had faced hardship. Nothing more. Thomas's pride demanded discretion. At the foundation offices, Thomas began as an observer, sitting quietly in meetings where executives discussed inspection protocols and educational initiatives. But his silence did not last long. Within days, he was raising his hand, pointing out flaws in their approaches, asking questions that made comfortable administrators uncomfortable. Why did inspections only happen during business hours when violations often occurred during prep work before dawn? Why did educational materials use clinical language that poor communities could not understand? Why did no one teach children to recognize danger signs in the food they received at schools or shelters? His street-level perspective was revolutionary. Thomas suggested the foundation train homeless individuals as volunteer food safety monitors, giving them purpose and creating an invisible network of watchers across the city. Winter melted into spring, and spring bloomed into summer. 6 months passed like pages turning in a story that neither Richard nor Thomas had dared to imagine. The hollow-eyed boy who had once sorted through dumpsters now sat at dining tables doing homework, his face fuller, his eyes clearer, though still carrying the wisdom that hardship had etched into his soul. He would never be a normal child, innocent and carefree, but he was healing in the way broken bones heal, stronger at the fracture points. School became his new sanctuary, replacing the library. His teachers marveled at his intelligence, his hunger for knowledge, though they worried about his intensity, the way he could not seem to relax into childhood. Thomas earned top marks in biology and chemistry, subjects that fed his passion for understanding food at its molecular level. He joined the debate team and argued with fierce eloquence about food justice and safety regulations. Richard attended every debate, sitting in the back row, his heart swelling with something that felt dangerously close to paternal pride. At the foundation, Thomas was no longer an observer, but a driving force. His proposal to create a youth food safety corps, training teenagers from underserved communities to become certified in basic food handling, had been adopted citywide. His suggestion to include food safety education in homeless shelters, teaching people not just where to get food, but how to assess its safety, had prevented countless illnesses. He had convinced the city council to require temperature logs to be posted publicly in all food assistance programs, making the invisible visible. Richard watched Thomas flourish and felt his own transformation. The mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. Thomas came for dinners twice a week, maintaining his independence but allowing connection. They talked about Daniel sometimes, sharing memories and grief without drowning in it. Richard's ex-wife had called once. Having heard through mutual friends about the boy Richard was mentoring, she wanted to meet Thomas, to understand this strange second chance. 1 year after that bitter November evening, when a desperate warning had changed 2 lives forever, Richard and Thomas returned to the community center together. This time, they walked through the door side by side, equals in purpose, if not in age. The same plastic-covered tables were arranged in rows. The same volunteers moved between them with ladles and serving spoons. But the kitchen was different now, transformed by new equipment and protocols, funded by Richard's foundation and designed by Thomas's insight. Margaret greeted them with tears in her eyes and pulled Thomas into a fierce hug. The boy who had once fled into the night now stood tall and confident, wearing a polo shirt embroidered with the foundation's logo, carrying a presentation folder under his arm. He was 13 now, taller, healthier, but still carrying those ancient eyes that saw what others missed. Thomas stood before the assembled volunteers and taught them what he knew, not with condescension but with the authority of someone who understood that knowledge meant the difference between life and death. He demonstrated proper food storage, explained temperature danger zones, showed them how to identify spoilage before it became tragedy. The volunteers listened, rapt, as this young boy spoke with the precision of a scientist and the passion of a survivor. Richard watched from the back of the room, his chest tight with emotions he had thought died with Daniel. Daniel could never be replaced, would always be the hole in Richard's heart that nothing could fill. But Thomas had become something else entirely, something unexpected and precious, a second chance at purpose. A reminder that from the deepest grief could grow the most profound connection. When the presentation ended, they left together, walking into the golden light of an autumn sunset. Their shadows stretched long across the pavement, merging into a single silhouette that moved as one. Thomas said something that made Richard laugh, a sound that had been absent from his life for far too long. They disappeared around the corner, heading toward whatever came next. Together. And so we learn that kindness sees what others miss, that the smallest voice can carry the most important warning, that sometimes the most broken people are the ones who can heal each other. We learn that dignity is not determined by wealth, that wisdom can live in a child's eyes, that salvation sometimes comes from the places we least expect. One act of courage, one moment of listening, one decision to honor rather than dismiss, can change everything. This is not just their story. It is a reminder to all of us to see the invisible, to hear the unheard, to recognize that every person we pass carries knowledge and worth beyond what their circumstances suggest. So the next time you encounter someone society has forgotten, remember Thomas. Remember that the person you dismiss might be the one trying to save your life.